Hello, my friends. We are live on the Bradley J. Show. And yesterday my computer was out of whack, so we couldn't do the usual Friday thing with Rich Rubino, but we're doing it today instead. Rich is the author of a cool political trivia book. Show him the book
Ah,
quick, because a lot of people don't stay long, and we want them. There it is. What's the name of it again? It's
the Great
huge.
American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids.
You know, that is a tough one for me to remember, so thank you for doing it. But you have other books. You can check out Rich Rubino. Today we're going to talk about
Yes.
we're going to talk about political conventions, and there's some exciting things that have gone on. There are some pivotal moments at conventions. Well, I don't know where you want to start. Do you want to start with the history of conventions, or,
Yeah.
or maybe this?
Yeah.
What is the function of the convention in modern American politics?
It's different now than it was historically. And the reason it's kind of significant now is basically this past week, the Democrats chose Chicago as the point they're going to have, that's a place they're going to have their convention. The Republicans are going to do Milwaukee. And it's interesting because it was originally started actually by a third party, the Anti-Masonic Party, back in 1832. And it was kind of, they were trying to kind of, it was, as you hear today about getting the stranglehold of lobbyists and big money out of politics. But it used to be that they were actually chosen as for caucuses. Basically, there'd be a caucus of basically the kind of the muckety muck, if you will, of the party would select who their nominee was going to be. So in 1832, this third party decided to go a different way and actually have a convention where they would have delegates, and the delegates would choose. And interestingly, we basically had that, and it gradually evolved into primaries. A primary is where somebody actually votes in it, where somebody goes in either a primary or a caucus and votes for a candidate, well, technically they're not voting for candidates. You're actually voting for delegates, and the delegates then go and they're pledged to a certain person on the first ballot. If someone doesn't win on the first ballot, they can go wherever they want on the second and third, and sometimes third or fourth ballot. But it's interesting in terms of when the primaries began. Really, was in 1912 was really the first year that the Republicans certainly used primaries, and Theodore Roosevelt actually won the preponderance of the primaries. But William Howard Taft had the support of the party convention, essentially the establishment of the party, the high command of the party, if you will. So Theodore Roosevelt said, essentially, throwing my hat in the ring, and I'm going to run as a progressive. So a couple weeks later, at the same place, they had their convention again for Theodore Roosevelt, and he won the Progressive Party nomination. So basically, there's always been this kind of dueling role between primaries and conventions. And yes, yes,
So this might be an exciting Republican convention because there are solid feelings that former President Trump will again be the nominee, but there's also a solid feeling that he will lose in a general. Is there any chance at the Republican convention they say, yeah, uh,
I,
we
no,
understand that you have a solid base, but we don't think you're going to win. We're going to choose somebody else.
very de minimis. Generally speaking, conventions today essentially just accede to the demands of the primary voters. Not really since 1968. 1968 changed all this. Hubert Humphrey was the establishment candidate, Lyndon Johnson's vice president. He didn't participate in any primaries. Eugene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, anti-Vietnam War candidate, did, and he won many primaries. He came to the convention, and the high command chose Hubert Humphrey. There was a revolution in Chicago that year, where the Democrats are going to have it this year. At Grant Park, there were riots, there were protests, and essentially that hurt the Democratic Party and probably was one of the main reasons why Hubert Humphrey lost. So basically, after that, the Democratic Party had what's called the McGovern-Fraser Commission, and they basically decided that the primaries would be the chief decider, if you will, of who's going to actually win the nomination. So whoever wins the primaries generally wins the nomination, and at the conventions, the Republicans followed suit on this. The conventions just basically accede to the demands, if you will, of the primary voters. Now, theoretically, the Republican convention could decide, you know what, we're gonna overrule what the primary voters did, but that would probably cause riots on the streets, especially with Trump supporters being so vociferous. It would
Mm.
really effectuate a chasm in the Republican Party, and that would have deleterious effects in the party. So basically, I think whoever wins a majority of the delegates almost assuredly will be the nominee. Now, that being said, there is a possibility that there could be a brokered convention. This happens every time If there's nobody still, if no one gets the majority of the delegates from the primaries, then essentially you have a brokered convention where the party bosses and everyone at the convention can decide in a second, third, fourth ballot that we want this person, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. As this is a bit of an aside, speaking of Trump being a leader in the primary, I heard somebody put forth the possibility that Alvin Bragg charging Trump was a tactic not to politically diminish him, but to politically enhance him, as everyone knew a charge would, because the Democrats do want to see him as an opponent in 24. What do you think about that? Are there Democrats working to get Trump to be the nominee, even though it's kind of maybe backdoor methods?
Yeah, I don't think so at all. I don't think that there's some sort of a conspiracy theory with Alvin Bragg. I do think, though, that the Democrats certainly are salivating at the possibility of running against Donald Trump because they think that he essentially has a ceiling of about 43%. They don't think, and that's being generous. They don't think they can actually get over that. Let's say there's 43% of people that, on some level, will support Donald Trump. They don't think that person will get that. Essentially, that cannot get over that. But that being said, generally speaking, the last election, 94% of Democrats who voted for Joe Biden. 94% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump. So whoever the Republican nominee is probably going to get over 90% of the vote, and the Democratic nominee is probably going to get over 90%. But certainly, I think the best possible scenario for the Democrats, and I don't think Bragg's involved in this, is that Donald Trump is the nominee. Donald Trump essentially propitiates his base, but on the other side of that, Joe Biden does the same. Not that they're necessarily for Joe Biden, but they're more so anti-Trump. So he galvanizes the other base, and moderate leaning voters would essentially hold their nose and vote for Joe Biden. I think that's generally the consensus amongst the Democratic Party is, yes, we want Donald Trump, baggage and all.
You use the word propitiate, and I can figure it out from the context, but I've never heard the word. So can you tell me what it means?
Propitiate just means to appease.
How do you spell it?
P-R-O.
Okay.
Propish. P-I-T. Propish. I-A. Propitiate.
Okay, close enough. Okay. And it means what?
It just means to appease somebody.
Appease somebody. You know, there's hair growth stuff called propecia. You think
yeah, that's right.
You think the words are related somehow?
I wonder. I bet there's some sort of a similar origin there. That's fascinating. Okay. I never thought of that. I never made that connection before.
All right. Okay. Forgive the interruption.
No, you're forgiven. You're forgiven.
Propitiate. Okay. What does it mean again? Propitiate. I have to use that word.
Propitiate. It means to appease.
Appease. Okay.
Give in to somebody.
All right. So I guess it'd be fun to get into some historic conventions that were pivotal conventions.
Yes. Well, the 1832 was the first one, and this is a third party that began this process, and then the other party said, us too. Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party at the time, said, well, we'll do essentially the same thing. So since then, most of the major parties have generally almost every year had conventions. And it used to be that the candidates themselves did not actually attend the conventions. So essentially, they would get a telegram saying that either they won the nomination, they didn't win the nomination. And actually, in 1880, James Garfield was the first nominee to attend the convention. He wasn't there to attend the convention. He wasn't there to actually seek the nomination. He was a Republican member of Congress, and he was actually, the Republicans had the control of the legislature in Ohio, and they had said that if they continue to have control, because back then the United States senators were actually appointed by the state legislators, that they would put James Garfield in the United States Senate. So he was the prospective Senate candidate and the prospective senator from Illinois and an incumbent United States congressman, Ohio, sorry. And he was there to basically give a speech for John Sherman. John Sherman, a fellow Ohioan former Treasury Secretary. And he goes up and he delivers a speech, and it is just magnificent. Now, the party was divided at the time. Ulysses S. Grant, who was from 1869 to 1877, did not seek a third term, even though he could have in 1876. some newspapers said he would be Caesarism, the idea that you would break George Washington's precedent and serve a third term. But then he took a 2-year tour around the world, became extremely popular, almost a demigod in some respects. And then in 1880, he says, "Yeah, put my name in at the convention for a possibility that I would actually serve a third term." So he's there, and you have this break in the Republican Party. You have the stalwarts like Grant, who were essentially like the current system of patronage and were against civil service reform. And then you had another group that essentially wanted civil service reform, and Garfield was part of that. Sherman was part of that. So you had this. So you had the convention. You had other candidates. You had James G. Blaine, for example, whose history, he was a Secretary of State. He was a Speaker of the House. He was a congressman from Maine. There was this huge divide in the party, and all of a sudden, people started yelling after Garfield's speech, nominating somebody else. Now, we want Garfield. We want Garfield. We want Garfield. And Garfield says, "No, I'm not here for that. I'm here to nominate somebody else." On the 23rd ballot, James Garfield garners the Republican presidential nomination reluctantly, and he accepts it. Of course, he's going to accept it. And in 1880, he actually wins one of the closest elections essentially in American history. And interestingly, at that convention, at the time, the presidential candidates did not choose their vice presidential candidates. Sometimes they didn't even know each other. When Rutherford B. Hayes found out that William Wheeler, congressman from New York, relatively unknown, was going to be his vice presidential running mate, you know what he said? "Who is Wheeler?" I'm ashamed to say, who is Wheeler? He literally had never heard of his own vice presidential running mate, but they actually became coefficients and they became relatively good friends during the Hayes administration. So the convention first decides they want Levy Morton to be the vice presidential candidate. Levy Morton was essentially almost, I guess you could say, a stooge of the political machine. Roscoe Conkling, a senator from New York, and Roscoe Conkling was very much against civil service reform, supporter of patronage, and he says to Levy Morton, "Don't take this nomination. James Garfield is not with us. You'd be a traitor to our cause if you took the nomination." And Levy Morton always wanted to be president. It was his dream. Levy Morton said, "Okay, I won't take the nomination." Then Chester A. Arthur, who was a former collector of tariffs in the Port of New York, who was fired by the incumbent Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes. People thought of him as kind of a patronage tribune, if you will. He's the second choice because they're trying to get two people on the ticket, one who supports civil service reform, one who supports the current system. So Chester A. Arthur is the next in line, and Levy Morton says to Chester A. Arthur, "No, you can't do anything that James Garfield offers. James Garfield is not one of us." But like Levy Morton, Chester A. Arthur always wanted to be president of the United States. So Chester A. Arthur says, "All right, I'll take it." James Garfield, of course, becomes president, ekes out a victory. And then that's about 9 months into the presidency, James Garfield is shot. Chester A. Arthur is president. And then Chester A. Arthur becomes president, the inimitable Chester A. Arthur. And what does he do? He reverses course and signs the Pendleton Act in 1882, which was essentially civil service reform. So by 1884, he was a man without a party. In some respects, those who had supported him all of a sudden said, "You're recreant, you're a traitor, everything else." And those who didn't support him, who hadn't supported him in 1880, said, "Oh, he was just doing that because for political reasons." So he didn't actually win the Republican Party nomination. That's the last time our incumbent Republican president sought his own party's nomination at the convention and lost it. And he lost it that year to James G. Blaine. But 1880 was probably one of the most awe-inspiring conventions in American history. And as I say, Garfield was there. He was there to nominate somebody else, but he was there. So he was the first person who was actually at the convention that nominated him, but he was there inadvertently.
So Garfield was assassinated in an interesting kind of way, right? Wasn't it a guy that had a gun in his hand wrapped in bandages?
Yes, and he was on his way to Massachusetts, believe it or not, at the time. So he was going to Amherst College to go to his college reunion. He was at the train station. And actually, Robert Todd Lincoln, who is the Secretary of State, was actually with him at the time. Weird coincidence, Robert Todd Lincoln, back in 1865, was supposed to go with Abraham Lincoln to the play at Ford's Theater, My American Cousin, but he didn't show up.
Didn't he almost fall on the train tracks? And the brother of
yes, Edmund Booth. That's another story. Yes.
Booth, yes, pulled him up from the tracks.
Fascinating how this happens. And then in 1900, when 1901, when William McKinley was shot, he was actually on his way to the fair in Buffalo to visit with to be there essentially while William McKinley was there. And then he finds out that William McKinley had been shot as well. So he really was there. He essentially he was not there for the first one, but the second assassination he did witness. The third one he almost witnessed, but he didn't quite get there on time.
Yeah. Okay. I interrupt a lot, so thanks for indulging.
No.
What about what's the next convention we're going to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think another fascinating one, and you come to the point, I guess, of let's talk about Warren G. Harding. So basically, Republicans and Democrats have what's called the keynote address, where essentially the person comes up, they give somebody who's a rising star in the party the chance to give a speech, and basically part of the speech is praising who the nominee is going to be, but it's really kind of to show the up-and-comer and someone who potentially could be a party's nominee in the future. And Warren G. Harding was a senator from Ohio. He was a first-term incumbent. He had literally just been elected in 1914, kind of a rising star. He gets up there and he gives a speech in support partly of Charles Evans Hughes, the Supreme Court justice who had to resign his seat to run for president. And then if he uses the term, he refers to the people who eventually created the country as the founding fathers. And that's the first known use of the term founding fathers. And what happened with Warren G. Harding? 4 years later, in 1920, the Republican Party was essentially split on who the nominee was going to be. And this is when primaries had very little impact. So the Republican convention, this was called smoke-filled. It's a little bit hyperbolic, but essentially, the party high command got together and they were looking for somebody who would be the least objectionable to the entire party. And they were talking about the idea, how about Warren G. Harding? Because he had really ruffled no feathers. He was a first-term senator from Ohio. He was somebody who was a relatively good speaker, and he had given that speech in 1916. So they said, let's put him to the convention. They put him to the convention, and he wins. Then they say, what about, they're looking for a vice presidential running mate, Irvin Len Root, the establishment candidate, the senator from Wisconsin. Let's choose him. And he was going to balance the ticket. Harding was a conservative. Len Root was a progressive. But there was another guy. There was another figure who was who had just been elected governor a few years earlier. At the time in Massachusetts, he only served 1 year, one gubernatorial term, and that was Calvin Coolidge. And Calvin Coolidge had rose from relative obscurity because during the Boston police strike, Samuel Gompers from the union sent him a letter asking his position on the police strike, and he basically said, there is no right to strike against the public good anytime, anywhere. With that catapulted him to become a champion of the conservatives in the Republican Party, which is ironic because as governor and as a candidate for governor, he had a relatively liberal liberal record. He very much supported state services, for example. But it was as I say that one instance really brought him up to the top, and all of a sudden someone started yelling when Irvin Len Root's name was put in nomination, "We want Coolidge, 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 Coolidge," and all of a sudden this governor of Massachusetts named Calvin Coolidge becomes the Republican vice presidential nominee. And Calvin Coolidge is wired because they don't go there at the time. He's back in Massachusetts. He gets the message. And one of the first people to write to him was Thomas Riley Marshall, who was Woodrow Wilson's vice president. And Thomas Riley Marshall wrote to him, "My sympathies," because he did not like the job very much. And he knew that essentially it was very ceremonial. But of course, you could be everything. So in 1923, Warren G. Harding dies. Calvin Coolidge is up in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, visiting his father at the homestead. And he finds out, he becomes president, and his father, who was the Justice of the Peace, actually swore in his own son to become president.
Wow. What about the conventions with riots?
Well, that was the most recent one, and this is why Chicago is so significant, would have been 1968. 1968 was a fascinating year. So you have a split in the Democratic Party. Lyndon Johnson comes in the first 2 years. Essentially, he's running with gas in the first 2 years, and you have Medicare, you have civil rights, you have the Rat Extermination Act, war on poverty. But then he becomes enveloped in Vietnam, and a lot of his loyal supporters gradually left. They were looking for somebody that would be an anti-Vietnam War candidate. They went to Senator Metcalf from Montana. He said no. They went to Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy said no. Finally, they went to Eugene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota, and Eugene McCarthy was known as basically being kind of a lackadaisical senator. His office was called the Office of Sleepy Hollow because essentially the thought was that he never actually did anything in there. But Eugene McCarthy said, yes, I'm going to do it. So all of a sudden, there's one candidate who's against Lyndon Johnson for the Vietnam War, and that's Eugene McCarthy. So all of essentially the young people who are afraid of getting drafted, who are very much against the Vietnam War, there's this gravitational pull toward this relatively uncharismatic intellectual senator from Minnesota. And what happened, Eugene McCarthy wins 42% of the vote, at 42.4% of the vote in New Hampshire, shocks the political world. Lyndon Johnson decides he's not going to seek his own term. He's the last president, by the way, who could have sought re-election, who did not seek re-election. And Lyndon Johnson doesn't run, so Eugene McCarthy runs, and Eugene McCarthy keeps winning the primaries. Robert Kennedy then gets in the race. Robert Kennedy wins some primaries. Robert Kennedy, of course, dies after winning the California primary. So essentially you have a scenario where Eugene McCarthy is the anti-Vietnam War candidate who was victorious in many of the primaries. Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, decides he's also going to get in the race, but he doesn't participate in any of the primaries except South Dakota, where he came in third. So what happens at the convention in Chicago is essentially because at the time primaries were not the be-all end-all. So essentially there were people at the convention. These were governors, these were senators, these were people who are very loyal to the party. They could vote at the convention, and they voted for Hubert Humphrey. So essentially they overrid the voters in terms of the primaries who supported Eugene McCarthy. And Hubert Humphrey was somebody who had been at least a reluctant supporter of Vietnam. He was actually originally a critic, and then he went to Vietnam, and then he came back and basically basically disavowed his past criticism of it, and said essentially this is part of the war on poverty, and we really need to liberate Vietnam. So he really kind of transmogrified his views on Vietnam. But by 1968, he wins the nomination. There was a peace plank that failed. So what happens in Grant Park in Chicago? There's essentially riots on the streets, and people are watching this in real time. They're watching this on television and saying, what happened to the Democratic Party? There's a huge chasm in the Democratic Party. Hubert Humphrey does win. Hubert Humphrey gives a speech, and he nominates Edmund Muskie, who is a senator from Maine, who is somewhat of an equivocator on Vietnam, becomes his vice presidential running mate. As I say, many of the McCarthy people sat on their hands that election, but on September 30th in Salt Lake City, Utah, Hubert Humphrey actually broke from President Johnson on Vietnam and said he would support a unilateral bombing halt if he became president as an acceptable risk for peace. So accordingly, many of those McCarthy supporters gradually went over to Humphrey, and Humphrey was gaining momentum. He had been 15 points behind the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, that summer. He was gaining momentum. Finally, by the way, Eugene McCarthy decided he was going to support Hubert Humphrey a week before the election, after really beseeching of him by the Humphrey campaign. And Eugene McCarthy kind of rallied. This is kind of Eugene McCarthy's. This has always been kind of his attitude. He's always kind of kind of a wise guy, if you will. He says, "I've agreed to support Vice President Hubert Humphrey for president, and I ask that my supporters suffer with me."
Wow.
A week before, this was Hubert Humphrey. A day before the election, Hubert Humphrey's doing a telecast where 3 hours of essentially you can call up and you can talk about how great Hubert Humphrey is. He calls up and he didn't give him a full threat endorsement, but many believe it was too late, and that convention probably ruined Hubert Humphrey's chances of being president in 1968. And this is really interesting because after that, the Democrats did reform, and George McGovern, a senator from South Dakota, was one. It was called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. Basically, they decided that the convention would have a lot less power and the primaries would have a lot less power. So you don't have the similar scenario. Would have a lot more power, rather. So in 1972, McGovern himself, he's a 200-to-1 long shot, very much anti-Vietnam, gets in the race to run in 1972, and he actually picks up fire. Eugene McCarthy also gets in the race, but a lot of Eugene McCarthy supporters were anti-Vietnam, not pro-McCarthy. So McCarthy only wins 3.46% of the vote, of the popular vote, and was never really seen as a serious candidate. But interestingly, and this is where Hubert Humphrey comes in. Hubert Humphrey is one of the establishment candidates that year. Ed Muskie runs again. Henry Scoop Jackson runs. Henry Scoop Jackson, who was very much a supporter of the Vietnam War, runs. So you have a litany of other candidates, and Humphrey disavowed his past support for Vietnam and says essentially we were all wrong on Vietnam. But Hubert Humphrey actually won the majority of votes in the Democratic primary, but he lost the nomination. Very simple, the exact opposite, contrary-wise to what happened to him in 1968. Why? Because California, which was toward the end of the primary process, was winner take all. Meaning essentially you win one more vote than the next guy in California, you have every delegate from California. So George McGovern wins the state of California, and with that, he musters the Democratic Party nomination. And Hubert Humphrey, who had in 1968 only participated in one primary but won the nomination, actually in 1972 won more votes than George McGovern, but in a very similar to the Electoral College, he lands up losing the nomination to George McGovern, and George McGovern goes on to win the lowly state of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia when Richard Nixon, of course, won the general election.
So we have a question from Phil Kate, and this popped up earlier when you were talking about, obviously, Coolidge. And I don't know if this is a joke, or maybe this is an actual question, sorry. What did Dorothy Parker say when she heard Coolidge had died? Something about rolls or something?
He said, she said, how could they tell?
Oh, is that true?
Yes, because Coolidge was known as Silent Cal. Okay. And the story, he was always known for, the story is at one point when he was president, he was sitting down at a table and someone said, I made a bet that I could get 3 words out of you today. And Coolidge looks at her and says, you lose.
That's a good one.
And here's another one about Coolidge, actually.
And Phil says you are correct. Wow, that's pretty impressive. Very good.
Yes. And Coolidge, when he left to become vice president, Channing Cox, who actually had the same initials of him, his former lieutenant governor, becomes governor of Massachusetts. So Coolidge comes back to Massachusetts and visits Cox. And he's at the State House, and Cox says, I don't understand. You would get out of here at 4 o'clock just about every single day. He said, I'm here till 9, 10, 11 o'clock sometimes. He says, I don't get it. People just talk to me all day long. How did you get out? And Coolidge looked at him and says, you talk back.
Oh, I see. And why did LBJ hang on to the Vietnam War? I mean, he hated it. It was clear that everybody hated it. Why did he stick with it?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. I think
the domino theory was still a theory. Like people still felt that was a possibility for one, and they didn't want to say that those boys that had died for nothing.
That was part of it, and of course, the domino theory was actually first acerbated by Dwight Eisenhower, who sent very few troops. There was actually Kennedy who began. He came with about 600 troops. By the time he died, there were about 16,000 troops. They were technically advisors, but essentially, they would be on planes, and it would have South Vietnamese insignia, but they were really American pilots. So Kennedy really started to precipitate the war. I think Johnson, first of all, he thought that essentially that was what John F. Kennedy wanted. Part of it is 1961 inauguration address. The only time he mentioned domestic policy was when he said the word "end at home." Everything else was about foreign policy. He talked about bearing any burden, basically for the future of mankind. Basically saying that part of the Kennedy doctrine was that we need to protect our allies and we need to protect the world against communism. And he saw this as Vietnam as kind of a flashpoint, if you will, for that. There was also a treaty that the United States had signed in the 1950s, which basically said that the United States has to defend South Vietnam. Now, did that mean militarily? Probably not. And in 1964, when Johnson was running for his own term, he used to say, "I don't want American boys dying I don't want American boys fighting for Vietnam, fighting when a war that Vietnamese boys should be fighting for themselves." So essentially, what changed him? Part of it, I think he probably thought that he would have been impeached had he brought troops home. I think he thought he would have been impeached. And it's interesting, Hubert Humphrey, after Lyndon Johnson wins 61% of the vote in 1964, elephantine landslide, Copernican, if you will. Hubert Humphrey sends him a memo. Hubert Humphrey's the new vice president, basically says, you now have the political capital to leave Vietnam. Johnson ignored that. And he actually decided that Humphrey could no longer come to certain cabinet meetings or certain foreign policy meetings. Humphrey later disavowed that, went to Vietnam, and came back and said, yes, this is essentially the right cause. But that would have been the time to essentially precipitate a withdrawal from Vietnam. I think that there was the thought of, in terms of the Democratic Party, they knew that Truman had gotten blamed in the 1950s for who lost China, and they thought the same thing would happen, who lost Vietnam, in terms of, I think President Johnson certainly thought that. I also think, and there's an interview with him in 1972, right before he died, where essentially he said, the United States has never abrogated a treaty that we signed. We were obligated, essentially. And he had problems. He was in the center in terms of, he supported gradual escalation. That's what the policy was called. On the one hand, were the doves like McCarthy, who said we need to have a phased withdrawal. On the right, there were other people who were essentially almost like Curtis LeMay, who said that we need to get over our phobia of using nuclear weapons and we can win that way. And then there was Johnson, who would gradually escalate. He would gradually escalate, send more troops in, more troops in, more troops in. He became very unpopular by 1967, 1968. And there were protests. Hey, LBJ, how many boys did you kill today? Essentially people yelling that in front of the White House. Many, certainly young people, certainly turned on President Johnson. In 1968, he probably would not have won the Democratic presidential nomination. After in New Hampshire, there was a poll showing McCarthy ahead of him in Wisconsin, which would have been the next probable primary. But there are so many questions why he did that. And you're right, he was reluctant, in terms of, there was a telephone call between him and his mentor, Georgia Senator Richard Russell. And basically, they're both saying that this is a no-win war. There's no way we're essentially going to win. He used to say, I don't know how we can get in it, how we can get out of it. There's another call where he's talking to Martin Luther King Jr., saying, I don't know how we can get out of this. But he was very much a reluctant warrior. He was someone who wanted his legacy to be domestic policy, never cared much about foreign policy, the exact opposite of his successor, Richard Nixon, and his predecessor, John F. Kennedy. But obviously there were, it was almost, there were very few actually dissenting voices. George Ball, an Undersecretary of State, and Hubert Humphrey were the only dissenting voices. Other members of the former Kennedy administration were saying, yeah, we need to go in there. Robert McNamara being one of them. The Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, saying essentially, we need to win this war. General Westmoreland kept asking him for more troops. Eventually, it enveloped his presidency and destroyed the presidency and destroyed him and killed millions of people.
So I have a quiz question here. Someone is asking, you want to take it?
I'll try it.
All right. Let's see. There it is. Wait a minute. There it is. What medal was LBJ controversially awarded, and by whom?
I believe it was the Bronze Star, and I believe it was by MacArthur.
All right. Let's find out if that's right. Give us a Phil Kate. Give us an answer.
This is for his one mission that he did when he was actually the first member of the United States Congress. He was a House member from Texas to serve in Vietnam, but he was basically doing it as an advisor. And so he got this, and some members of his platoon were very critical of him later in life for that.
So Phil Kate says Silver Star.
Silver Star.
I'm going to give you a lot of credit for that, because you did get the general time and the reason and all. That's pretty darn impressive, wouldn't you say there, Phil Kate? All right. Any more pivotal and controversial?
Yeah. A couple that it's interesting.
Conventions?
Yeah, it's interesting because I talk about how primaries used to matter. I think in terms of the last ones, so the question's got to be asked, when was the last time the nominee was actually chosen at the convention? And there were the last time it was actually, in other words, there was no outright majority. And technically they're always chosen at the convention, but usually it's just a formality. The person.
I don't know. I give up.
Well, the couple in the Republican side, in 1976, Gerald Ford had won Iowa, won New Hampshire, and then Ronald Reagan, all of a sudden, after 6 primaries, wins the state of North Carolina with Jesse Helms' support. Ronald Reagan's running to the right. It gets to the convention, and Reagan makes a weird decision. He chooses Richard Schweitzer, a very liberal senator from Pennsylvania, as his vice presidential running mate to show that he essentially can compromise, or shall we say, propitiate the rest of the party. So Ford, of course, had Rockefeller originally as his vice president. He had to drop Rockefeller from the ticket because of the ire, if you will, of the right wing of the Republican Party. So Ford and Reagan run at the convention. And at one point, Jesse Helms is very critical of Ronald Reagan's choice of his vice presidential running mate. And he said, Ronald Reagan said that if he would become the nominee, this would be his vice presidential running mate. He suggests, why don't we support somebody else? But essentially, it gets extremely close. It gets down to the point of Mississippi making the final call, and less than 100 votes, Gerald Ford actually garners the Republican nomination. It's a very divided party, very much divided over the Cold War. Ford had continued Nixon's policies of détente, relaxation of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. He decided that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet dissident, should not meet with him at the White House. That precipitated Ronald Reagan to say, I'm going to get in this race and we need to essentially win the Cold War. We can't deal with the Soviets. But it was a very close election. And after that convention, Ronald Reagan, Ford asked Reagan to campaign for him more. Reagan did a few kind of pro forma speeches, but he also wanted to campaign for people who had campaigned for him in '76. So he went and did that instead. And Ford later said that because Reagan had said he had other commitments, he thinks he would have actually won the presidency had Reagan campaigned for him more. He always blamed Reagan for that. And in 1980, Jimmy Carter was actually losing 2-1 at one point in the primaries in 1980. Then the hostage crisis happened. There's a rally around the flag effect. So he starts to win. And that year he had two major, technically he had three. There was Governor Finch of Mississippi, but he wasn't considered a major candidate. And then there were two other candidates who ran against him that year, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, and Ted Kennedy, the senator from Massachusetts. And Carter lands up winning at the convention. And then there's a moment where Jimmy Carter goes up to Ted Kennedy and wants Ted Kennedy to kind of raise his hand. Ted Kennedy just kind of shakes it. And that shows the chasm there is in the Democratic Party between the Kennedy forces on the left. Many on the left never really liked Jimmy Carter. They thought of Jimmy Carter as an imposter. Back in 1976, Jerry Brown and Frank Church from Idaho came in the race later on to try to stalk Carter. The stalk Carter movement, they thought Carter was way too conservative for the party. But Carter, of course, landed up losing the presidential election that year in 1980. And then 4 years later, there was also a contested convention. And that was between Gary Hart, the senator from Colorado. This is before the monkey business thing. And the incumbent vice president, Walter Mondale. And Walter Mondale, of course, landed up winning the Democratic presidential nomination, but was very much divided. And I'll say that one more that is absolutely fascinating to me is 1992. Bill Clinton pretty much overwhelmingly won the nomination that year. Partly by winning, it was the New York primary, which kind of, not officially, but it really kind of put him over the top and made him the front runner. He kept winning. And part of that was so Jerry Brown that year had said that if he was the presidential nominee, he would choose Jesse Jackson as his running mate. And that created some angst among many Jewish Americans because Jesse Jackson had made what they believed was an anti-Semitic slur during his 1984 presidential campaign. So many of them turned away from Jerry Brown. Interestingly, that year, Jerry Brown, he's running in a Democratic primary now, not a Republican, a Democratic primary, and he's calling for a 13% flat tax. Imagine a Democrat doing that today. And he has an advertisement where Archie Bunker, Carol O'Connor, and Carol Reiner from All in the Family are basically talking about what a good guy Jerry Brown is and how they support the 13% flat tax. They're in character, and they both in character essentially say, this is the one thing we both agree on. So Jerry Brown keeps running. Bill Clinton sews up the nomination in New York City that year. But Jerry Brown is not unlike Paul Tsongas, Tom Harkin, Doug Wilder, Doug Wilder that year, Bob Kerrey. They all endorsed Bill Clinton as the nominee. Jerry Brown did not. And there was a kind of, in the fine print for the Democratic Party platform, it said that you can give a speech without nominating your opponent if you are nominating essentially yourself or somebody else is nominating. So he gets up and he actually nominates himself. He gives a 20-minute address. And in that speech, he never endorses Bill Clinton or merely mentions the name Bill Clinton. He talks about campaign finance reform. He talks about the corporate stranglehold. And people start cheering Jerry Brown. And this shows a divide in the Democratic Party because imagine actually because you have to legally allow him, by the Democratic Party rules that is, allow him to give his speech. So he gives a speech, nominates himself, of course, lands up losing, but it showed the chasm in the Democratic Party. And it shows these kind of polyphonic forces between the Clinton establishment forces and the Jerry Brown insurrectionist forces. And then there were a couple other things. The other one was Bob Casey. Bob Casey was the incumbent governor of Pennsylvania, and he wanted to give a speech as well. He would not endorse Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton, their official policy for the Clinton campaign, and Ron Brown, who was the chairman of the Democratic Party. By the way, Ron Brown, when they said Jerry Brown was going to give up in speech, well, so Jerry will be Jerry. That's what Jerry Brown does, essentially. So Ron Brown was kind of became almost a surreptitious supporter of Clinton throughout the primaries. But essentially, Robert Casey wanted to give a speech. He wasn't going to nominate himself for president, so that he wasn't allowed to. But Robert Casey was also somebody who was opposed to abortion rights. So the Republican Party used that, exploited it, and said the Democratic Party is so intolerant that they don't allow candidates who are opposed to Bill Clinton on abortion rights to give a speech at the convention. Now, Casey, this is interesting, because Casey said his speech would be focused on abortion. There were other candidates, John Breaux, the senator from Missouri, Hal Heflin, for example, the senator from Alabama, had given speeches at the convention, as had 5 Democratic governors who were opposed to abortion, all gave speeches at the convention, but they never mentioned the word abortion. Casey was going to actually mention the word abortion in his speech. So this created, obviously, some negative news for the Democratic Party, some bad news, if you will, their question of intolerance. And Ron Brown had to say, basically, well, Casey's not going to support our ticket, so because he won't say he's going to support our ticket, we're not going to let him speak. Then after that, when the media came to him, he said, oh, yes, I absolutely, I support the ticket. So it just was a very much an embarrassing moment between Bill Clinton and Governor Casey. And Governor Casey, by the way, went to Ron Brown asking for a speech, went to Ann Richards, the incumbent governor of Texas, and neither of them essentially let him speak. But this convention was where it really brought Bill Clinton out of the shadows. People did not know that Bill Clinton had come from a relatively poor family. So there was this video that they made, Henry Thomason, a Hollywood filmmaker originally from Arkansas, made this film called The Man from Hope. And in it, he essentially talks about his roots. Now, he'd only spent his first few years in Hope. He actually grew up in Hot Springs. So, but I guess Hope springs eternal. But this convention video, right before Bill Clinton gets up and gives a speech, really, I think, put Bill Clinton in the lead, and he never really vanished that lead. Now, Ross Perot drops out of the race. People think, oh, this is going to hurt Bill Clinton. But it actually didn't necessarily hurt Bill Clinton. Ross Perot later came in. I mean, it came into the race, and Clinton chooses Al Gore, the youngest ticket in any major party ticket in American history. Interesting. Al Gore gives a speech at the convention. Jerry Brown had been very critical of the Gore choice. Jesse Jackson said it's 2 wings of the same bird, and they're both basically conservative. But the Clinton-Gore ticket was interesting because it was essentially two Southern moderates, 2 Southern Christians who attended church every week, young, they would jog together, and it really inoculated the Democratic Party from the charges that they're a bunch of essentially Eastern elites, which had hurt George McGovern, had hurt Walter Mondale, had hurt Mike Dukakis. And after that convention in New York was really what precipitated it, and that Man from Hope video presented Bill Clinton in a different light, and it was hard for Republicans to pin him as an Ivy League elitist, which is really a cyanide pill in American politics.
Can I ask? Thank you for all that on the conventions. Before we go, can I ask you your opinion on something?
You can try.
Okay. So a lot of the MAGA candidates do very well because they basically are perceived to support Trump. Trump
Yes.
is the charismatic leader, but of course, actually, Trump is backpedaled or broken from them in some ways, so they actually seem more extreme than he. But is there a danger that the really, 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 really super crazy people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are going to alienate themselves from the Trump people? Because now she's, I believe I read that she was supporting the person who is alleged to have spilled the beans on our sensitive documents. She's supporting him, and what is it? How is that supporting Donald Trump? Isn't that just being crazy?
It's something that's going to hurt. It hurts Donald Trump in part because Donald Trump has praised her so many times.
And does it hurt her? Are they going to say, okay, enough, and just she'll be out of office? I mean,
no,
you're saying she's not too far over the top for her core to say, good God, this is awful.
First of all, in her congressional district, it goes from about Lookout Mountain from the Tennessee border to Georgia down to some of the Atlanta suburbs, one of the most conservative places in the
Okay, but you
nation.
can be conservative and not
Whoever the Republican,
she's anti-American now.
no one's going to run. No sane Republican, unless they're just doing it to be a sacrificial lamb or they're doing it to send a message, is going to challenge her in the Republican
Even though
primary.
she's now clearly anti-American.
No, because she's very popular in her district.
But why?
And why
does she stay popular in her district?
They would say that
being anti-American.
They think, well, being anti-American, I guess, is it's like, it's like the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter. Everyone has their own interpretation of it. Essentially,
it's tough to interpret the giving of these documents, these U.S. secrets, as a freedom fighter.
She would say it's like, well, it's like the same thing with Edwin Snowden. To some people, he's a freedom fighter. To other people, certainly to Barack Obama, for example, he's a traitor. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene would essentially spin it and say essentially that she's doing this for America. And I think most of her supporters in her district would do the same. And my prediction is in a bad election next year, if Trump is wiped out nationally and loses the state of Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene will win about 59% of the vote, and that's the worst case scenario in the general election. If there's a Republican primary challenger, that person will get about 17% in the primary, and they'd be lucky to do that. And Marjorie Taylor Greene will go on and win the nomination. If she's not chosen as Donald Trump's running mate, which she suggested that if that were the case, she would take him up in the offer. Now, if Donald Trump wants to do a complete kamikaze mission in terms of trying to destroy the Republican Party, let's say the Republican Party says, all right, we're going to nominate somebody other than Donald Trump. Donald Trump says, all right, I exit stage right from the Republican Party. And just like Theodore Roosevelt, I'm stripped to the buff and I'm throwing my hat in the ring and I'm forming a third party. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be my running mate. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Donald Trump. That's, I think, the worst. That's the biggest fear Republicans essentially have. But generally, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's somebody establishment Republicans despise her. Okay, most Republicans who've been in the party for years, they want her out, and they probably want to say the same thing about Donald Trump. But mega Republicans think that she's somebody who's taken on the swamp. They like the rhetoric. There are people who like the rhetoric, and they think that essentially she's taking on the swamp. They like the fact that she's somebody from outside of politics. They like the fact that she's got unbridled rhetoric, and essentially, there's really nothing that I think there's nothing that would take away their support for Marjorie Taylor Greene. She can serve she can serve essentially for the rest of her life in the United States House of Representatives. I think my guess is Republicans probably want her to run for Senate and then lose the primary, but
I can't go along with that. I mean, you may be right, but I can't allow myself to believe that the people in her district are so bereft of any decency that they would continue to vote for her when there are plenty of equally conservative people there that aren't so conservative that they're anti-American. It's so weird that Republicans have a wing of Republicans are now the anti-American wing of the Republican Party.
I mean, they would interpret it differently. They would say that we're supporting the real America, that essentially they would say America has been taken over. They would say it's been taken over by the woke culture. It's been taken over by the liberals or the communists. They would say
different than throwing your service people fellow service people under the bus by
it's all a matter of interpretation.
Secrets.
And I'm sure if you talk to her supporters, they would not say they're anti-American. They would say we're the true patriots. That's what they would probably
by undermining the security and therefore the economic security of the United States. That interpretation is as nuts as she is, and it's super disturbing that there are enough people that would remain with her after supporting a potential traitor to the United States. That's crazy. To me,
yeah, no, I know.
What has to happen is it has to become clear that kind of behavior, the Marjorie Taylor Greene behavior, will not be rewarded by being reelected. I pray. I think that's the most important thing. I mean,
not in Northwest Georgia. If she's running in Cambridge, maybe, but no. Northwest Georgia is a lot different. I mean that district. There are some
anti-American different.
They would say, of course, we're the true patriots. Just like they would say there are some people that think that the January 6th insurrectionists are not really insurrectionists. they would say that these are essentially the contemporaneous versions of the revolutionaries.
Those people, the January 6th insurrectionists, you can see that they believed that their country was being stolen.
Right.
They are incorrect,
but they believe
at least they believed something that I can understand. Whereas saying, "Oh, this is good that you put our country at risk," is an entirely different thing. This is not. I'm trying to with that kid. I'm not trying to take back the country they took away. This is you are destroying the country. No one on either side disagrees with that. When you talk about giving away, you're not making the country better when you give away its military secrets.
They have. It's just like the issue of the debt ceiling, and whether you say, some people might say, well, if we default, maybe that's actually good for America. So I mean, I think that I think if you actually talk to those people, they would have a different.
I would like to see, and not Trump MAGA people, but the worst Marjorie Taylor Greene, super crazy people. I would like to listen. I don't want to speak to them, but I'd like to listen to them.
That would be a great show.
I'd like to see how many of them there really are.
That would be a great
really
show.
Support that say, yeah, it's good that we throw our country under the bus by giving away military secrets, making us weaker, and making our allies making the world dangerous for both us and our allies, and that undermines our economic security too. I don't see why they don't get that.
I will say Lori Bobart, who's seen as kind of her they're kind of seen as a tandem, even though they have some differences. In her district, she was actually reelected with less than 1,000 votes last time.
She kind of has to be a little careful because her margin is pretty close.
And last time around, Trump wins the district by 9 points. She wins by less than 1,000 votes. And there are polls now showing she's very vulnerable. Remember, part of her district, yes, it goes up to conservative parts like Grand Junction rural, but it's also Aspen. And Aspen is not a citadel of cultural conservatism. So there's I think that Democrats are probably going to put a lot of eggs trying to defeat her. Now, the other side of that is, would they rather actually have her cede the seat and actually have her in office so that they can use her as a boogie woman, if you will, and continue to say, this is what a member of Congress is saying. This is what, they can make. If I were the Democratic Party, I would have a trifecta. I would have a big thing. I'd call them the Gang of Three, like Mitt Romney did back in 2002. We talked about Tom Finneran, the Speaker of the House, Robert Trivellini, the incoming Senate President, and Shannon O'Brien, who would defeat him for governor, the treasurer. And he said, this is a gang of three. If you elect them, these three will essentially be in power. For the Democrats in 2024, you could essentially, let's say Donald Trump doesn't win the nomination. Let's say it's Tim Scott, and Tim Scott is seen as less threatening. So you say, well, the gang of three is going to be in charge, and you have Matt Gaetz, Lori Bobart, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, all, and say, essentially, do you want these people to be in charge of the country and just really make them face cards, if you will, of the party? If they don't have that, and actually this is true with Marjorie Taylor Greene too. If Marjorie Taylor Greene let's say she ran for Senate and lost, and then she never House seat anymore, the Democrats could not essentially try to allegate every other Republican running from everything from cemetery commission to president as somehow a clone of Marjorie Taylor Greene. So they probably, in some respects, want her to continue and stay in the House for as long as possible.
I see. I would like to see the rest of the United States boycott her district, Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, in terms of everything, from tourism to saying we're pulling our businesses out of here.
But that would hurt a lot of little people too.
The little people that vote for her.
There would be a lot.
There's got to be consequences for supporting that kind of nutness.
There would be a lot of. I just know it's just like what happens with economic sanctions. They oftentimes they will hurt the people. They have unintended consequences, and they will hurt people that maybe some of them may not even vote. Some of them may have voted against her, but there are people that could also be hurt in that.
Well, maybe those people can move out of that district. I don't know.
Maybe there could be a mass exodus. They can move people up. They can move people.
If you can figure out better consequences for that kind of behavior, then please do. There's people a lot smart people out there. How can Marjorie Taylor Greene be made to pay politically for what she is doing? Man. Okay.
Well, the best scenario, again, I think for the Republican Party, is that somehow she decides she wants to move up. She runs for something else. She runs for a Senate seat or something to that effect. And I mean, the state has 2 Democratic senators right now. She runs, and then she loses the primary, loses the general election, and then she's no longer in office, and she can't be seen as kind of a bugaboo in terms of the Republican Party. But if she continues to serve in the House, and she's on 2 very prominent committees now, the Homeland Security Committee and the Government Oversight Committee, and every time she asks questions of somebody on those 2 committees, you know that every major network is going to be covering it and is going to be saying this is what Marjorie Taylor Greene said, because Marjorie Taylor Greene is not, your rank and file kind of milquetoast congressperson. Right. She's somebody that gets ratings. So essentially, right. that's essentially I don't think she's ever going to be a chairman of a committee, but she's on 2 very powerful committees.
As long as the speaker is in, he had to do that because of his weak position. As long as he's in there, I guess he has to do that. I just don't like the lesson that we see now that that's the way to power. It's crazy. Crazy is the way to power. I need the cautionary tale to be crazy is not the way to power.
But then the other side of that, though, in the Senate, for example, you have Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, the majority leader and minority leader, who are very much kind of milquetoast establishment politicians. Chuck Schumer starts in the House, goes to the Senate. Mitch McConnell goes from working in the Ford administration, then runs for a Senate seat. So, I mean, there are, and in the case of Mitch McConnell, and to some degree Chuck Schumer as well, they're not necessarily charismatic figures, but they've been able to work their way up the process, and in some case be recreant to their own party. Chuck Schumer voted for the Iraq War, for example. Mitch McConnell has voted with Joe Biden on the infrastructure plan, and somehow they're establishment candidates, but they're still hegemonic over their parties.
So we're approaching an hour. I will say it was rewarding to see New York give the bums rush to Marjorie Taylor Greene. That was pretty good. She didn't get a lot of traction in New York. She comes there and calls their city disgusting. It's a sad world now where crazy is rewarded like it is.
I remember Ted Cruz. Actually, this backfired on him. He went on Howie Carr's show, actually, in 2016 and he criticized Donald Trump for being from New York. He talked about how Donald Trump has New York values, and they're going to be playing New York if he becomes president. And the Trump campaign really kind of took him on. And then some people in New York, Peter King, one of the congressmen, for example, said, well, look what happened with us in September 11th. We united. Why is Ted Cruz going after New York? And it really kind of backfired him. But Ted Cruz was trying to portray Donald Trump as representing New York values. Now, of course, very few people would say that Donald Trump represents New York values, because he's not really necessarily seen as somebody as kind of that stereotypical liberal New Yorker.
I'd love to see him sell Trump Tower. He might not want to. He might not feel real good about coming to New York a lot. Oh, actually, maybe he'll need a place to stay for his various court appearances, so he'll hang on to the building for a while. I don't know. All right, wonderful day, wonderful session. Thank you very much, Rich Rubino. We'll do it again real soon, and everyone share and share alike. Thanks to Karen and particularly Phil Kate for his cool questions and
that was awesome.
Questions. And good for you, Rich Rubino, for getting them 85% right. Thank you. And that's it. We'll talk to you all soon. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.